I'm a lawyer, I'm a QC, I know what corruption means. It's not a word I use lightly. I think there is corruption in this process. I hope to be able to put the documents in the public domain that will show that. We wonder whether there has ever been another minister who has been found by the High Court to have broken the law and has responded by saying, I did nothing wrong. We are going to write to the High Court, drawing this to its attention. We do not think it is the right way for a minister to respond to a High Court finding that he's broken the law. I mean, a lot of that stuff is quite disingenuous as well, because the notion that the dude in the civil service who was valiantly trying to get anyone to support his attempts to comply with the law requiring transparency within 30 days, the notion that that guy, if he wasn't producing the contract award notices, would instead have been buying PPE is just, it's just nonsense. It's not supported by any truth. The notion that these were technical breaches somehow, I mean, Hancock focuses elsewhere on the fact that certainly by the end of the proceedings, they were 17 days late on average. But the contracts that were politically sensitive were held back for months and months and months. So the panic buying sort of ended in May. And in February, earlier this month, they were still publishing highly politically sensitive PPE contracts many, many, many months later. So, for example, they published another contract awarded to this jeweler based in Florida, Michael Sager, who did this deal with this odd Spanish businessman called Mr. Anderson. Mr. Anderson was to be paid more than $50 million by Mr. Sager, not for supplying PPE, but just for sort of acting as a go-between or an intermediary. All of the contracts that were politically sensitive, all or at least most of them, were held back for many, many months. And the High Court saw evidence that Number 10 asked for those contracts to be delayed, publication of those contracts to be delayed until it was more convenient for Number 10 to handle the comms in relation to them. So, you know, behind that rather blithe assertion that he did nothing wrong in breaking the law is a wealth of rather damning factual detail, it seems to me. The NAO has released 2 reports, and in its second report, it identified that we had spent £12.5 billion on PPE, and that PPE we had bought at about 500% of the price that we were paying in the fourth quarter of 2019, i.e. in the last full quarter before the pandemic. So we were paying 5 times the price, and we bought 5 years of supply at 5 times the price. So I think there are some very serious questions to be asked about how that happened as well. We know that some of it is sitting in fields in Suffolk, is in boats coming from China, is stored in China. Indeed, the NAO said the other day that government has bought so much of it that it is now having to appoint investigators to find it all. It's bought so much it doesn't know where it is. And it's not just the staggering quantity at the staggering prices either. Substantially every case we have looked at involving individual suppliers where we've been able to get proper transparency over what was actually supplied from these sometimes very odd counterparties has revealed that the PPE supplied by those counterparties was duff. So Ianda, we know that Ianda supplied £155 million of unusable face masks. We know that Pestfix supplied, I think it's between 50 and 60 million pounds of unusable face masks. We know that Sager, the company owned by this Florida jeweler, supplied £70 million worth of sterile surgical gowns that can't be used as sterile surgical gowns because they're not wrapped in such a way as preserve their sterility. We know that there is something odd, although we can't yet get government to tell us what, about the gowns that were supplied by this Northern Irish confectioner, Clandboy agencies. Government says of them, not that they are being used as gowns, but that they are available for use as part of the PPE suite or something like that. And, you know, every lawyer knows that when you see a formulation like that, it is hiding something. And the thing that is hiding is not a thing that is nice for the hider. So however you look at it, price, quantity, quality, the whole thing is a real disaster. Last weekend, we wrote a letter to government about a £145 million contract awarded to Deloitte. And we think that over the course of the pandemic, something like £1.3 billion has been awarded to consultancy firms alone by this government. And we think that one of the reasons why so much has been spent is that the civil service is so hollowed out that it can't do any of these things itself. Indeed, my own suspicion is that the civil service is so hollowed out that they're not even able properly to manage their relationships with contractors. And I think that the government's continued disinclination to come clean about the companies that went through its velvet roped VIP lane, come clean about who went through, which ministers put them in the VIP lane, because the National Audit Office report identifies that the majority of people who went through the VIP lane were put in by ministers. What contracts, what successful contracts were won by those in the VIP lane, and what prices were paid to those successful VIP lane bidders. The government's refusal to come clean about any of that stuff, I think, is deeply, deeply troubling. It's not just troubling to me. The head of the National Audit Office, the sort of government spending watchdog, was asked by the Financial Times, can you rule out corruption in the procurement process? And Gareth Davies, from memory, I think is his name, said there are very serious weaknesses in the processes that government has adopted, and I can't rule out corruption. It's striking stuff. What it really signals is that this government thinks that the law is something that applies to other people. We got that when Brandon Lewis talked about a specific and a limited breach of law. We got that when Boris Johnson refused to send the letter mandated by the Benn Act requesting an extension. He said he'd rather die in a ditch. We also got that when he did nothing after Dominic Cummings' appalling visit to Barnard Castle. What Hancock's description of his law-breaking as technical reveals is that this government thinks that the law is something that applies to other people, but not to them. And I think that's completely unacceptable.